Under the grey sky of a small coastal town, the funeral procession moved slowly toward the gates of St. Mary's Cemetery. The air was thick with rain and grief. Folding chairs sank slightly into the muddy ground as the widow's flag draped casket was lowered, the notes of a bugle trembling in the cold wind. Among the crowd stood James Jim Keller, a 56-year-old Marine veteran, shoulders broad despite the years, his dress blues pressed crisp. He hadn't slept much since his wife, Helen, lost her battle with cancer 6 days ago. He hadn't cried either. Marines weren't supposed to cry. But now, as the flag was folded and handed to him by a young corporal who couldn't have been older than 20, Jim's lips quivered. On behalf of a grateful nation, the words cut like glass, he took the flag, held it to his chest, and whispered, "Semper Fi, baby." Then the sound of rain on polished wood filled the silence. People began to drift away quietly, but Jim lingered near the grave alone. The cemetery attendants were packing up. He stood there for another 10 minutes, his mind running through years of deployments and separations, the promises he made to come home alive, and the guilt that she hadn't lived to see him finally retire. When he finally turned toward the parking lot, his boots were soaked, his uniform darkened by rain. The local police cruiser was parked near the entrance, its lights flashing unnecessarily. A young officer stood beside it, leaning against the hood, arms folded. Officer Greg Nolan, new to the force, still had the eager stiffness of someone who thought his badge made him invincible. He'd been assigned to keep the funeral traffic moving because the town mayor didn't want another clog-up near the highway. "Sir," Nolan called out, walking forward, "you can't park that truck there. It's in a restricted zone." Jim blinked at him, barely processing. "That's my wife's funeral," he said quietly. Nolan gestured at the pickup near the cemetery gates. "Still a violation. You'll need to move it." Jim stared at him for a moment, disbelief freezing him. "You can wait until the service is done." "The service is done," Nolan said sharply. "You've been standing there 20 minutes. Move it, or I'll have to tow it." "You'll do what?" Jim's voice was calm, low, the kind that made young recruits stand straighter. But Nolan didn't know Marines. He saw an older man in a uniform, probably a veteran, maybe stubborn. "Sir, I'm not asking again." "Then don't." Nolan stepped closer. "I need your ID." Jim sighed, exhausted. "Officer, it's my wife's funeral. You can write whatever you want later, but not right now." Nolan's patience cracked. "Sir, don't make this difficult." "Difficult?" Jim gave a tired laugh. "Son, you have no idea what difficult looks like." He turned to walk toward his truck, but Nolan grabbed his arm. The reflex was instant. Jim spun, breaking the grip. "Don't touch me." Nolan's hand went to his taser. "Last warning." Jim took a breath, lifted his palms. "Walk away, kid." A small crowd of remaining mourners turned, watching. The bugler, still packing his instrument, froze mid-motion. Nolan pulled the trigger. The sharp crack of the taser echoed through the cemetery, followed by the sight of the Marine veteran convulsing, collapsing into the mud. Gasps filled the air. "Jesus Christ!" Someone shouted. "He's a vet." The officer hesitated, shock registering for the first time, but his radio was already squawking. Within minutes, more units arrived, 2 more cruisers and an ambulance. Jim lay still, mud streaking his face, rain mixing with the faint tremor of electricity still crawling through his muscles. He wasn't dead, but his heart pounded like a drum. Paramedics knelt beside him, checking vitals. Someone was filming on their phone. Within minutes, the video would be online. Within an hour, it would go viral. 7 minutes later, as Officer Nolan stood near his cruiser, drenched and shaking, a convoy of motorcycles could be heard roaring from down the street. The sound grew louder, deeper, more synchronized, the unmistakable growl of military Harleys. The first Marine riders arrived before anyone knew what was happening. Their leather jackets bore the emblem of the Corps Eagle, globe, and anchor, patched with 1st Marine Brotherhood. They dismounted silently, about 24 of them, faces hardened by war and years. Among them was Major Gunny Travis Cole, retired, tall, built like a tank, his silver beard soaked with rain. He'd served with Jim in Fallujah. "What the hell happened here?" he demanded, his voice like thunder. No one answered. Who tased him? Nolan swallowed. "Sir, I was, sir." Gunny stepped closer. "Don't sir me. You just tased a Marine at his wife's funeral." "He resisted arrest," Nolan said weakly. "He was mourning," Gunny snapped, "and you assaulted him." By now, townspeople were gathering along the sidewalks, watching as the Marines spread out, blocking the street. They weren't armed, but their presence was enough to make every officer reach for their radios. Jim, helped up by the medics, waved weakly. "Travis," he said hoarsely, "don't let it go." "Can't do that, brother," Gunny replied. "Not this time." A captain from the local precinct arrived, shouting over the rain. "Everyone calm down. Let's not make this worse." Gunny turned to him, eyes burning. "You already did. You disrespected a Marine's widow. That man fought for this country. You think we're just going to stand by?" The captain hesitated, realizing the cameras were still rolling, the world already watching. "Look, we'll handle it internally." Internally? Gunny barked a laugh. "No, you'll apologize to him, right here, right now." The captain looked at Nolan. "Do it, sir, now." Nolan's jaw clenched, but the sight of 24 veterans staring him down broke his resolve. He stepped forward. "Mr. Keller, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. You shouldn't have touched him." Gunny interrupted. "Say it right." Nolan exhaled, trembling. "I shouldn't have touched you. I'm sorry." Jim just nodded, still clutching his flag. "Go home, son." The tension hung heavy, but something deeper shifted in the air. A recognition that the line between civilian authority and respect for service had been crossed. A few Marines knelt near the grave again, fixing the flag that had fallen slightly in the mud. Others formed a silent guard around Jim like a living shield. Reporters began to arrive. The first headline that evening read, "Officer tases Marine veteran at wife's funeral. Brotherhood responds." By nightfall, the video had over 5 million views. The mayor called an emergency meeting. The police chief was forced to release a statement condemning the officer's actions. By morning, the town was flooded with Marines from neighboring states, some in uniform, others in biker jackets. They came not for violence, but for justice. Hundreds lined the street outside the police station, holding American flags, saluting as Jim walked slowly through the crowd, cane in hand, flag tucked beneath his arm. Reporters tried to speak to him, but he just said, "My wife believed in forgiveness. I'm trying to remember how." Inside, the department suspended Nolan pending investigation. But outside, the real story was unfolding. The solidarity of the Corps. Marines stood shoulder to shoulder, blocking traffic, chanting softly, "Semper Fi, never die." It wasn't a riot, it was a message. Respect wasn't negotiable. As hours passed, even the townsfolk began to join. Local veterans arrived from the Navy and Army, saluting Jim as he passed. The sight was both haunting and powerful, a living wall of service and loyalty. By the second day, the national networks had picked it up. Politicians made statements, some calling for calm, others praising the Marines for their restraint. But those who knew the Corps understood. It wasn't about revenge, it was about honor. That evening, Jim sat by the ocean, the folded flag on his lap, the sound of waves mixing with the distant roar of engines as his brothers stood watch. Gunny sat beside him, silent. "She'd hate this," Jim said quietly. "All this attention," Gunny nodded. "Maybe, but she'd be proud you stood your ground. I didn't do anything. That's the point. You didn't have to." Jim looked at the horizon, eyes glistening. "When we came home from the war, she told me, 'Promise me you'll live like you still believe in good things.' Today I tried, but that kid," Gunny put a hand on his shoulder. He doesn't know what you've seen, what you've done, but he'll learn. The hard way, maybe, but he'll learn. Days later, Nolan resigned quietly without statement. The department implemented new training on veteran sensitivity. The town council renamed the cemetery's main road Helen Keller Way, at Jim's request, not for the famous figure, but for the woman who held a Marine together for 30 years. On the first Sunday after, the Marine riders gathered again, over 300 of them this time from across the state. They parked along the coastline, flags whipping in the wind, and stood in silence as Jim placed the folded flag atop his wife's headstone. He whispered something no one could hear, then turned to the crowd. "You all showed me something today," he said, voice steady. "That respect still exists. That brotherhood still means something. Thank you." The roar that followed could be heard for miles. But after the engines quieted and the crowd dispersed, Jim stayed. He looked up at the grey sky once more, rain starting to fall again. He smiled faintly. "Guess you got me one last time, huh, Helen?" Somewhere deep in the mist, the faint echo of the bugle seemed to answer. Later, when reporters tried to spin it as a protest, every Marine who was there said the same thing. It wasn't about anger. It was about love. Love for a fallen woman, love for a brother, and love for a code that never dies. In that small town, on that soaked patch of earth, a Marine had fallen, not in battle, but in heartbreak, and the Corps had risen, as it always did, to stand watch. The street outside the cemetery was never quite the same again. Locals said that even months later, they could still hear the faint rumble of bikes passing through at night, headlights flickering like ghosts on patrol, guarding the memory of one woman and one Marine whose story reminded them all of what respect really means.